Welcome to the channel, Dr. J.W. Morrison, theologist, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. We're going to look at some business here by a woman called Marine Farquhar. I don't believe she should be in the Australian Senate. To me, she comes across as a Palestinian representative. I don't think she's representing Australia at all. I think she's using Australia as a means of funding her interests in other nations.
Has been my past practice. I'll review it before we table, but we can distribute for information only.
I thought we had.
It's not mine, but
It's the senators. I'm just asking.
Anyway, the report also reports on at least almost 28,000 Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli attacks. 70% of those killed are reported to be women and children, and another almost 68,000 Palestinians who are injured, as well as 156 Unrwa staff who have been killed as of 10th of February.
What's it got? Did Australia attack them or did Israel attack them? She needs to go to Israel as a Palestinian senator and take it up with them. Stop bringing this rubbish to Australia.
Minister, on 27th January, you announced suspension of funding for Unrwa along with some other nations, effectively punishing 2 million people in Gaza by depriving them of critical support that Unrwa provides.
Now, Unrwa has been getting robbed left, right and centre by Hamas. I'm going to go straight to my next video, which is Anat. And she'll introduce herself, but this woman's an expert, the world's expert on Unrwa.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Einat Wilf. I was a member of parliament in Israel on behalf of the Labour Party with Ehud Barak. I worked with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Oslo Accords, with Shimon Peres as Vice Prime Minister of Israel. I call myself today a long-term peace activist, and one of the reasons that I have spent 15 years of my life by now writing, researching, speaking, advocating on issues relating to Unrwa is because I believe that anyone who seriously wants to seek peace and not just to talk about it should look deeply into the way that Unrwa has been an obstacle to that eventuality. So,
what a lot of people don't realise is it's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with Unrwa is the enabler of the dysfunction in Palestine. It's like a mother that won't let a child grow up on its own 2 feet. Listen very carefully to what this lady is about to educate us in, and you are going to be shocked, and it's going to expose Marie Farquhar as well.
I hope to make the compelling case that I have not wasted the last 15 years of my life by focusing on Unrwa, and I want to make the case that Unrwa is not some kind of fringe issue or a small aspect. If you want to understand the conflict, if you want to understand how we got here, and even more important, if you want to understand how we get out of here, how we get out of the conflict, how we move forward, Unrwa is the key. So first, a bit of history, because in the history, we understand pretty much everything. After the War of 1948, there are hundreds of thousands of refugees. That is not special, as I'm sure you know, certainly being in the United Nations. The 20th century is marked by the political transition from empires to states. We begin the 20th century when much of the world is divided between empires. We end the 20th century when much of the world is divided between states. That's why we have almost 200 in the United Nations. This process has been bloody. It involved 2 world wars, numerous regional wars, and civil wars. In the process of the transition from empires to states, tens of millions of people became refugees. Hindus and Muslims, Germans, Ukrainians, Poles, Bulgarians, Turks, Greeks, Jews. And as the process took place, the message to all these tens of millions of refugees was clear. It's tough, it's tragic, and you move on. This is why there are hundreds of millions of descendants, of many of whom you are, I'm sure, do not consider themselves refugees today. Except for one group, the Palestinians. Why is it? After the war of 1948, I will add in parentheses an entirely unnecessary war, because the Arabs, as you well know from the UN partition plan, could have said yes, had an Arab state living side by side in peace to a Jewish state. But they, they themselves said, it was more important for them that there should not be a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea than they should have an Arab state in part of it. So they go to a completely unnecessary war. It's a brutal year-and-a-half-long war, and in the course of that war, people become refugees. It's not special. The refugees are to be settled. The Jewish refugees are settled, of course, by Israel, and the Arab refugees are to be settled by a temporary mechanism. Now, it's not special at that time to have a temporary mechanism to settle refugees. Why? Because, again, it's understood that once the war is over, the refugees are settled, and settling refugees is how you end wars. So the idea is to create a temporary mechanism for 18 months, because the assumption is that 18 months should be enough time to settle several hundreds of thousands of Arab refugees in the places to which they fled or were expelled: the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But the Arab refugees themselves refuse to settle. They attack the installations. They attack the staff. Why? Because they understand that if they are settled, then the war is over and the Jewish state gets to live. And that is unacceptable. They just waged a brutal year-and-a-half war so that there would not be a Jewish state. They waged a 30-year war before that against it, but especially a year-and-a-half. So they refuse to settle. So what they do is they take this temporary mechanism and they do three things. The first is this temporary mechanism was going to be called REW, or Unrwa. But they want it to be called Unrwa. They want the letters UN to be in it. Why? Because from their perspective, the UN is responsible for the fact that they are refugees. The fact that they just waged a completely unnecessary war, they completely do not consider it. The fact that the do not consider it. The fact that the refugees are the consequences of that war, none of their business. In their telling, the UN created Israel. They always refused to grant the Jews agency. So the UN created Israel. The West created Israel. The UN is responsible. So they insist that this mechanism be called Unrwa, so that it be clear from the beginning that the UN is responsible for the fact that there are Arab refugees from the war. And this is an ideology that plagues us to the present. Abu Marzouk, a senior Hamas official, said in an interview a few months ago, when he was asked, why don't you let the people of Gaza use the tunnels for their protection? He's like, what? The tunnels are for us. The people of Gaza, they're the responsibility of the UN.
So Hamas doesn't care about the Palestinian people. You've got to understand this. They've killed them. They've used them as human shields. They'll put their rocket launch sites at schools, hospitals, and other community places. Don't underestimate what's happening over there. It's not what you are being portrayed to believe.
So he is still telling you, this is still fundamental to the ideology, that they are not responsible. It's the responsibility of the UN. So one, they want it to be called UNRWA. Two, they want to create a loophole. Why? Because during the 18 months when UNRWA is created as a temporary mechanism to settle the refugees, the UN creates the actual body for the refugees, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, to implement the Refugee Convention. Now, according to the Refugee Convention is indeed in the spirit of settling refugees. So according to the Refugee Convention, there are three ways where one can no longer be a refugee. One is return. If you can return home, great, wonderful. But if not, the Refugee Convention does not prioritize repatriation and return. You can either be settled in place or get citizenship and protection of a third country. All of these are equally valid means of ending a refugee status. Now, the Arab refugees and their supporters in the Arab world, which were the ones who were pushing it through the UN, knew that if the Arabs would be settled according to the Refugee Convention within a few years, there would be no more Arab refugees, which means that the war is over and the Jewish state gets to live, again, unacceptable. So they want a loophole. And the way they secure the loophole is that the UNHCR says that it will deal with all refugees in the world except those who have an agency. And now step 3 is to make sure that the agency never closes. because the loophole, the fact that the Arab refugees are not subject to the Refugee Convention and to the international standards, depends on the fact that UNRWA should never close. And just so we have a sense of what it looks like when a temporary refugee agency actually does its job. You know, we don't always have alternative history in the world, but sometimes we do.
UNRWA was only set up to be a temporary agency to help these people re-establish themselves. But the Arabs knew that if that happened, Israel would not be annihilated, and they would have to then have the responsibility of building their state themselves, and they didn't want that to happen. So they made UNRWA be an organization that should never close.
So a bit after UNRWA is established, there is another temporary agency established for the war in Korea, and it's called UNRWA. The K is for Korea. In Korea, there are 3.1 million refugees, more than 4 times the number of Arab refugees. UNRWA settles all of them in 3 years with 1/3 of UNRWA's budget. No one returns home, and look at South Korea today. It could have been the Palestinians. It could have been the Arab world.
Now, this is a massive revelation for many of you because you didn't know that this problem was in Korea between the Koreans. 4 times the amount of refugees in comparison to the Arab refugees, and UNRWA, the case for Korea, settled all of them in 3 years with 1/3 of UNRWA's budget, and no one returns home. So it all worked out for the best. This is, you've got to open your eyes, viewers. You're being blindsided. They're using your pity. They're as evil as you can get.
South Korea was a wasteland in the early 50s, and look what they made of it. You don't have 20 million Korean refugee descendants sitting on the 38th parallel, seething with visions of revenge. They moved on, like all tens of millions of refugees from that time, and built a different future.
And that's the whole point, isn't it? The Palestinians are just not going to allow that to happen. They don't want it to happen because it's not about whether they're refugees or not. It's about the annihilation of Israel. Open your eyes, please, viewers.
But the Arab refugees would not, and because this is the Cold War and there's oil, the Arab countries are able to push the West to get their way. So UNRWA is called UNRWA, it gets a loophole, and it never closes. So now we're at the end of the 50s, and we have a situation. UNRWA is clearly a failed agency. Just so there's no questions, everyone knows already in the 50s that UNRWA is a failed agency because it's not settling a single Arab refugee.
So it failed even back in the 50s because it wasn't accomplishing what it was there for.
But also, the West and the UN have just been blackmailed by the Arab world to not close UNRWA. So UNRWA cannot settle a single refugee. It can't close. So what is it going to do? And it begins to do busy work. Initially, vocational training. The vocational training soon becomes the vast education network of UNRWA in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan.
So what it did was, rather than try and settle refugees into a civilized way of living, they began to educate. But the problem with this was, what are they educating these people in?
Now, in that education system, essentially a Palestinian nationalism is born. In the UNRWA schools, it brings together all the Arab refugees to create a Palestinian nationalism, which in itself is not a problem. A lot of nationalisms were born after World War II, except that the nationalism that is born in the UNRWA schools is one that is singularly focused on revenge and return. Under the letters UN and with Western funding.
Under the letters UN and with Western funding. Now remember, Penny Wong pulled the funding out from underneath this woman, and she's come into bat for the Palestinians. No.
Generation after generation is being brought up with that loophole to believe that they are still refugees. And I'll explain in a moment how ridiculous it is according to international standards. And their entire identity is based not on a positive, constructive vision of creating a Palestinian state, but on the destructive vision of destroying the Jewish state. And just in case people think that return is an innocent idea, when I called the book The War of Return, people thought it was a bit harsh. People think that return is some innocent idea, a nostalgia for a home of a great-grandmother long gone. If you read the Arab-Palestinian texts from the 50s and 60s, they're very clear about what return is. Return is October 7th. Return is described in the Palestinian texts as a brutal triumph over the Jewish state. We will tear their hearts out of their bodies, their fingernails. This is why you saw so much exhilaration and elation on October 7th. Because for 75 years, Palestinians in the Unrwa schools have been groomed for that moment.
See, what you've got to understand is it's all about the annihilation of Israel. That's all it is. And these people have been groomed.
Of the brutal triumph over the Jewish state. That is their vision of return. That has been under the letters UN and with Western funding. And the connection between UNRWA and terrorism is an old one. When the Western countries caved to our pressure to keep UNRWA open, they thought, okay, this organization will do no good. They knew that this organization will do no good, but they thought at least it would do no harm. Thank you. But imagine that you go to school every day, and the letters UN are above your school, and you know that it's funded with Western money, so the nice kind of countries, and you hear in that school that there was once a mythical land of Palestine, and it was stolen from you, and it is occupied by evil foreigners who don't belong there. And one day, when you grow up, you have the duty, the noble duty, to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. If you hear that every day, you will grow up, and the first person that puts a gun in your hand and tells you, we are going to the 1972 Munich Olympics, we are going to the quarters of the Israeli athletes, you are going to be elated. You are going to be thrilled. And this is why the perpetrators of the massacre of the Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics are children of the Unrwa schools. It's graduates. This is why Hamas are the graduates of the Unrwa systems, the schools, the so-called refugee camps.
So are you getting the gist of it? It's all a system. These people are groomed. Now let's just quickly look at where the river to the sea is. The river to the sea is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, we saw before that the Gaza Strip, and this is just surmising, is in around this area here. But they want all of it. They want from the sea, from the river, right, the Jordan River, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And until they get it, the land of Israel, they're never going to be happy. So we know the Gaza Strip's somewhere along here, but they want all of it. They want from the river to the sea. And I wish I could get a bigger picture, but this is what they've given me. So we'll turn to Google Earth. And it shows us the Gaza Strip. I'll just come out a bit and I'll get out of the way. I'll get over there out of it. And this is the Gaza Strip here, and it shows... Just let me fix this up a bit, viewers. Bear with me, please. There's Gaza, there's Jerusalem, and there's the river, the Jordan River. Okay? Now, the Palestinians, whatever their totality of land is, they're not going to be happy until they have the land from the river to the sea. They want the land from the river to the sea. And that's 7,000, well, say 80,000 meters or something. Look, you can see over there, and down here. Just let me do that again. There's the river. Is it going to let me? Come on, no, it's not going to let me again. We'll take that out. Yeah, it's going to let me. If you go down here, you'll hear a lot of talk about Unrwa. That's the river to the sea as well. I'd mark it with pencil, but I don't know how to do that. It's a vast area that they want. They want all this area, and they're never going to be able to have it because it's just not how it works.
It is an intimate connection. It actually doesn't matter if 5 or 10 or 15 or 0 UNRWA employees actually participated in the October 7th massacre. Because UNRWA is the ideological backbone that births, decade after decade, generation after generation, violent Palestinian organization committed to the idea of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea.
Now, many of you wouldn't have known this. You would have no clue of this at all. Okay, probably Penny Wong possibly doesn't even know this, but we needed to know it. UNRWA is the birthplace, right? UNRWA is the organization that's creating these Palestinian monsters.
Which is why they are Black September and the Democratic Front and now Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And even if Israel manages to get rid of the 30,000 trained murderers of Hamas, it will change nothing as long as UNRWA continues to serve as this ideological backbone that births terrorist organizations committed to the idea of return and revenge and no Jewish state.
So did you understand that? Even if Israel manages to get rid of the 30,000 trained murderers of Hamas, it will change nothing as long as UNRWA continues to serve as the ideological background that births terrorist organizations committed to the idea of return and revenge and no Jewish state. So the problem, UNRWA, right, is where they spawn the terrorists.
So how do we get out of it? First of all, we need to understand the absurdity of the situation. Because UNRWA has this loophole, UNRWA doesn't operate by any international standards. It counts today 5.9 million refugees. Almost none of them by any international standard are refugees. 40% of them are citizens of Jordan. Tomorrow, Jordan